Marcus Wellington had built his empire from nothing. Starting with a small construction company 20 years ago, he now owned hotels, restaurants, and shopping centers across 3 states. His wealth was beyond what most people could imagine, but it came at a price. He spent most of his time traveling between cities, checking on his businesses, making deals, and expanding his empire. Marcus lived alone in a massive mansion that sat on 15 acres of perfectly maintained land. The house had 12 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a library, a home theater, and a wine cellar that cost more than most people's houses. But despite all this luxury, Marcus rarely got to enjoy it. He was always on the road, always working, always chasing the next big opportunity. 3 months ago, Marcus had hired Grace Johnson to take care of his home while he was away. Grace was a quiet woman in her 40s who had excellent references from other wealthy families in the area. She was professional, reliable, and kept to herself. Marcus had met her only twice before leaving for his latest business trip to Europe and Asia. The trip was supposed to take 2 months, but it stretched longer as new opportunities kept arising. During his travels, Marcus received weekly reports from Grace through his assistant. The house was being maintained perfectly. The gardens looked beautiful and everything was running smoothly. Grace seemed like the perfect housekeeper, exactly what Marcus needed to keep his home in order while he focused on his business empire. But Marcus had no idea what Grace was really doing in his absence. He had no clue about the secret she was keeping, or the incredible things she did every single day in his house. If he had known, it would have changed everything about how he saw her and how he saw himself. The business trip finally came to an end when Marcus closed a major deal in Tokyo. He was exhausted but satisfied as he boarded his private jet back to the United States. He hadn't told anyone he was coming home early, not his assistant, not his business partners, and certainly not Grace. He wanted to surprise everyone and maybe finally get some rest in his own home. As the plane crossed over the Pacific Ocean, Marcus looked out the window and thought about his life. He had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, but he was lonely. He had no family, few real friends, and no one who cared about him for who he was rather than what he could do for them. Sometimes he wondered if all his success was worth the isolation it brought. The flight landed at a small private airport just outside the city. Marcus grabbed his luggage and drove himself home in the car he kept parked there. It felt strange to be driving his own car after months of having drivers and assistants handle everything for him. As he drove through the familiar streets toward his mansion, he felt a mix of excitement and nervousness about being home. It was early afternoon when Marcus pulled into his long driveway. The gardens looked more beautiful than ever. The flowers were blooming perfectly, the grass was a rich green, and even the fountain in the center of the circular driveway was sparkling clean. Grace had clearly been taking excellent care of everything, just as her reports had indicated. Marcus parked his car and walked toward the front door, pulling out his keys. He paused for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of his property. Birds singing in the trees, water flowing in the fountain, and something else he couldn't quite identify. There seemed to be voices coming from somewhere, but he couldn't tell where they were coming from or what they were saying. He unlocked the front door and stepped into his grand foyer. The marble floors were spotless. The chandelier sparkled like new, and fresh flowers sat on the table in the center of the room. Everything looked perfect, but those voices were louder now. They seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper in the house, and Marcus was curious about what was going on. Marcus set down his luggage and walked quietly toward the sound. The voices were getting clearer as he moved through his house, and he realized they weren't just 1 or 2 people talking. It sounded like many voices, including children's voices, all mixed together in what seemed like conversation and laughter. This was very strange because Grace lived alone and wasn't supposed to have visitors in his house without permission. As Marcus got closer to the source of the voices, he began to feel concerned. Had Grace been throwing parties in his house while he was away? Was she letting people use his home without his knowledge? He had trusted her completely, but maybe that trust had been misplaced. The voices were coming from the direction of his large living room, and Marcus decided he needed to see what was happening right away. Marcus approached the entrance to his living room carefully, not wanting to make noise that would alert whoever was inside. The voices were very clear now. He could hear children laughing, adults talking, and what sounded like some kind of organized activity happening. His heart was beating faster as he prepared to confront Grace about this unauthorized use of his home. But nothing could have prepared Marcus for what he was about to see. As he reached the doorway and looked into his living room, he stopped cold. His mouth fell open, his eyes went wide, and for a moment he couldn't believe what he was witnessing. Grace was there, but she wasn't throwing a party or entertaining friends. What she was doing was something Marcus had never expected, something that would change his entire understanding of who she was and what she meant to his life. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, unable to process what he was seeing. His massive living room had been completely transformed. The expensive furniture had been moved aside, and the floor was covered with colorful blankets and cushions. About 20 children of different ages were sitting in a circle, all listening intently to Grace, who was sitting in the center reading from a large picture book. But these weren't ordinary children having a playdate. As Marcus looked more carefully, he realized that many of the children had special needs. Some were in wheelchairs, others had visible disabilities, and several appeared to have developmental challenges. Grace was reading to them in a gentle, patient voice, showing them the pictures and asking questions that made them giggle and participate. Around the edge of the room, Marcus saw several adults who were obviously the parents and caregivers of these children. They were watching Grace with expressions of gratitude and relief. Some were sitting quietly, enjoying a rare moment of peace, while others were talking softly among themselves. Marcus noticed that many of the parents looked tired, like people who rarely got a break from their demanding responsibilities. Grace finished reading the story and closed the book. The children clapped and asked for another one, but Grace smiled and shook her head. She told them it was time for their next activity, and asked everyone to stand up carefully. Marcus watched in amazement as Grace helped each child who needed assistance, speaking to them individually and making sure no one felt left out or forgotten. What happened next surprised Marcus even more. Grace had set up different activity stations around the room. There was a table with art supplies where children could draw or paint, an area with musical instruments where they could make noise and express themselves, and a quiet corner with soft toys for children who needed a calmer environment. Grace moved between all the stations, helping each child find an activity that suited their abilities and interests. Marcus realized that Grace had turned his formal, cold living room into a warm, welcoming space where children with special needs could play, learn, and just be themselves. She had created something beautiful in his house, something that brought joy and relief to families who probably struggled to find places where their children were accepted and understood. As Marcus continued watching, he noticed details that showed how much thought Grace had put into this. She had covered his expensive coffee table with soft padding, so children wouldn't get hurt. She had placed protective coverings on his valuable paintings and decorations. She had even brought in special equipment like ramps for wheelchairs and adapted toys that children with limited mobility could use. One little girl in a wheelchair rolled up to Grace and tugged on her shirt. Grace immediately knelt down to the child's level and listened as the girl whispered something in her ear. Grace nodded seriously, then stood up and announced to everyone that Emma had a special song she wanted to share. The room became quiet as Grace helped Emma position herself where everyone could see her. Emma began singing a simple song in a sweet, clear voice. She couldn't pronounce all the words perfectly, but her joy was obvious as she sang about friendship and happiness. When she finished, all the children and adults clapped enthusiastically. Grace hugged Emma and told her what a beautiful song it was, making the little girl beam with pride. Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. His eyes were filling with tears. He was witnessing something pure and beautiful, something that had nothing to do with money or success or business deals. Grace was giving these children and their families something priceless, a place where they belonged, where they were valued, and where they could experience joy without judgment. A mother sitting near the window caught Marcus's attention. She was watching her son, who appeared to have autism, as he carefully arranged colored blocks in a specific pattern. The boy was completely focused on his task, and his mother was watching him with a mix of love and worry that Marcus recognized as the expression of someone who cared deeply about another person's happiness. Grace noticed the same thing and walked over to the boy. Instead of interrupting his work, she sat down beside him and watched what he was doing. After a few minutes, she quietly asked him to tell her about his pattern. The boy looked up at her briefly, then began explaining his system in a rapid, excited voice. Grace listened to every word, asked thoughtful questions, and praised his creativity and attention to detail. Marcus saw the mother's face relax as she watched this interaction. It was clear that Grace understood how to communicate with her son, how to enter his world without disrupting it. This was a skill that took patience, knowledge, and genuine care, qualities that Marcus was realizing Grace possessed in abundance. The afternoon continued with Grace managing all the different activities while making sure every child felt included and every parent felt supported. She seemed to know each child's specific needs and preferences. She knew which children needed extra encouragement, which ones needed space to work independently, and which ones benefited from group activities. Marcus noticed that Grace had also prepared snacks that accommodated various dietary restrictions and medical needs. Some children had special cups that made drinking easier. Others had foods that were cut into specific shapes or sizes. Grace had thought of everything, and she moved through these responsibilities with the skill of someone who had been doing this work for a long time. As Marcus stood there watching, he began to understand that this wasn't just a one-time event. The way Grace interacted with the children and parents, the way she had organized his living room, and the comfortable way everyone behaved suggested that this gathering had been happening regularly. Grace had been using his house to create a support program for families with special needs children, and she had been doing it with incredible dedication and love. But Marcus still didn't understand the full scope of what Grace was doing, or why she had chosen to do it in his house without asking permission. He was about to find out that what he was witnessing was only the beginning of Grace's secret activities. Marcus remained hidden in the doorway, trying to process everything he was witnessing. As the afternoon progressed, he watched Grace interact with each child with remarkable skill and patience. She seemed to understand exactly what each child needed, whether it was encouragement, space, physical assistance, or just someone to listen to them. About an hour later, Grace began organizing the children for what she called circle time. She helped them form a circle on the soft blankets, with each child positioned in a way that worked best for their individual needs. Some sat cross-legged, others remained in their wheelchairs, and a few lay down on their stomachs. Grace made sure everyone was comfortable and could see each other. What followed amazed Marcus even more. Grace began leading the children in simple exercises that were adapted for different ability levels. Children who couldn't move their legs could still participate by moving their arms. Children who had trouble following complex instructions could copy simple movements. Grace had created activities that allowed every single child to participate and succeed, regardless of their limitations. During the exercises, Marcus overheard conversations between the parents that revealed more about what Grace was doing. One mother mentioned that this was the only place her daughter felt confident trying new things. Another parent talked about how much progress her son had made since starting to attend these gatherings. A father quietly thanked another parent for telling him about Grace's program, saying it had been a lifesaver for his family. Marcus began to realize that Grace had created something much bigger than just a playgroup. She had established a support network for families who often felt isolated and overwhelmed. These parents had found a community where their children were accepted, and where they could share experiences with others who understood their challenges. As the activities continued, Grace announced that it was time for talent sharing. She explained that anyone who wanted to could show the group something they were proud of, or something they had been working on. Marcus watched as children eagerly raised their hands, excited to participate. The first child to share was a boy who appeared to have cerebral palsy. With Grace's help, he demonstrated how he had learned to use a special computer program to create digital art. His movements were slow and required significant effort, but his pride in his artwork was obvious. Grace helped him show his colorful designs to everyone, and the group responded with genuine enthusiasm and appreciation. Next, a girl with Down syndrome performed a dance routine she had choreographed herself. Her movements weren't technically perfect, but her joy and creativity were beautiful to watch. She spun and jumped with complete abandon, and when she finished, she received a standing ovation from everyone in the room. Grace hugged her tightly and praised her creativity and hard work. Marcus found himself completely absorbed in watching these children share their talents and achievements. He realized he had never seen such pure joy and mutual support. In his business world, people were always competing with each other, trying to prove they were better or smarter or more successful. But here, everyone was genuinely happy about each other's accomplishments. A teenage boy with autism showed the group his collection of detailed drawings of trains. He knew every fact about each type of train he had drawn, and Grace encouraged him to share his knowledge with everyone. The other children listened intently as he explained the differences between steam engines and electric trains, and several asked thoughtful questions that made him beam with pride. As Marcus continued watching, he noticed something that touched him deeply. Grace wasn't just supervising these activities. She was genuinely enjoying herself. Her smiles were real, her laughter was spontaneous, and her interactions with each child showed authentic care and interest. This wasn't a job for Grace. It was something she was passionate about. One of the mothers approached Grace during a quiet moment and handed her an envelope. Marcus couldn't hear their entire conversation, but he caught enough to understand that the parent was trying to pay Grace for her services. Grace gently refused the money and explained that she didn't do this work for payment. She said that having the space to bring the children together was payment enough for her. This exchange made Marcus curious about Grace's motivations. Why was she dedicating so much time and energy to helping these families? Why was she using his house without permission? And why was she refusing payment for providing such valuable services? He was beginning to understand that there was much more to Grace's story than he had realized. Near the end of the gathering, Grace organized a group art project. She had brought large sheets of paper and washable paints, and she helped all the children work together to create a collaborative painting. Each child contributed according to their abilities. Some painted with brushes, others used their fingers, and a few used adaptive tools that Grace had provided. As the children worked on their painting, Marcus overheard a conversation between two mothers that gave him more insight into Grace's impact on these families. One woman was telling the other about how much her son had changed since beginning to attend these gatherings. She said he had become more confident, more willing to try new things, and happier overall. The other mother shared that Grace had helped her connect with resources she didn't know existed. Grace had given her information about special education programs, therapy services, and support groups that had made a huge difference in her family's life. She said Grace somehow knew about every resource available to families with special needs children in the area. Marcus realized that Grace wasn't just providing a play space for these children. She was serving as an advocate, resource coordinator, and support system for entire families. She was filling gaps in services that these families needed, and she was doing it all as a volunteer in his house while he paid her to be his housekeeper. As the afternoon drew to a close, Grace began helping the children clean up their activities. She made the cleanup process into a game, encouraging the children to work together and praising their efforts. Even children who had difficulty with motor skills found ways to help, whether by holding a trash bag or wiping down a table. The parents began gathering their children's belongings and preparing to leave. Marcus could see that no one wanted the day to end. The children were reluctant to stop their activities, and the parents seemed refreshed and relaxed in a way that suggested they didn't often experience such peaceful afternoons. As families began saying their goodbyes, Marcus realized he was about to face a decision. He could continue hiding and pretend he hadn't seen any of this, or he could reveal himself and confront Grace about using his house without permission. But after witnessing what Grace had created, Marcus wasn't sure what the right thing to do was anymore. Marcus watched as the families began to leave, each parent taking time to thank Grace personally. Their gratitude was obvious and heartfelt. These weren't polite pleasantries, but genuine expressions of appreciation from people whose lives had been touched by Grace's kindness. Several children hugged Grace tightly before leaving, and she hugged each one back with equal warmth. The last family to leave was the mother with the teenage boy who had shared his train drawings. As she gathered her son's artwork, she spoke quietly with Grace about concerns she had regarding her son's transition to adult services. Grace listened carefully and promised to research options and resources that might help. She gave the mother her phone number and told her to call anytime she had questions or needed support. After everyone had gone, Grace began the process of returning Marcus's living room to its original state. She carefully moved all the furniture back to its proper positions, rolled up the blankets and cushions, and packed away all the toys and supplies she had brought. Marcus was impressed by how methodically she worked, and how she seemed to remember exactly where every item belonged. As Grace cleaned, Marcus noticed she was moving more slowly than she had during the activities with the children. She looked tired, and he realized she had been giving her full energy to those families for hours without taking any breaks for herself. Despite her exhaustion, she was making sure his house was returned to perfect condition. Marcus faced a dilemma. He could continue hiding until Grace finished cleaning and left, then pretend this had never happened. Alternatively, he could reveal himself now and demand an explanation for why she had been using his house without permission. But there was a third option that he hadn't considered. Before, he could reveal himself and try to understand why Grace had chosen to do this work and why she had done it in his home. Before, Marcus could decide what to do. Grace did something that made his decision for him. As she was putting away the last of the art supplies, she stopped and looked around his living room with an expression of deep sadness. She walked over to one of his expensive paintings, an abstract piece that had cost him $50,000, and stood in front of it for a long moment. Marcus couldn't hear what Grace said, but he saw her lips moving as if she were talking to herself or perhaps to the room itself. Then Grace did something unexpected. She began to cry. Not loud sobs, but quiet tears that seemed to come from a place of deep emotion. She wiped her eyes quickly and continued cleaning. But Marcus had seen enough to know that whatever was motivating Grace to do this work was very personal to her. Marcus made his decision. He stepped into the living room and cleared his throat gently to announce his presence. Grace turned around quickly, her eyes wide with surprise and fear. She immediately began apologizing, explaining that she knew she shouldn't have used his house without permission, and that she would understand if he wanted to fire her immediately. But Marcus held up his hand to stop her apologies. He told Grace that he had been watching for the past few hours and that he wanted to understand what he had witnessed. He said he wasn't angry, just curious about why she had chosen to do this work and why she had done it in his home without asking permission first. Grace sat down heavily in one of his chairs, looking exhausted and worried. She began to explain her story, and Marcus realized it was much more complex than he had imagined. Grace told him that she had a younger brother named David, who had been born with multiple disabilities. When Grace was growing up, her family had struggled to find places where David was accepted and where he could participate in activities with other children. Grace described how isolated her family had become because of the challenges they faced. Many places weren't accessible for David's wheelchair, and people often stared or made comments that hurt his feelings. Her parents had spent years searching for programs and services that could help David, but resources were limited and waiting lists were long. When David was 12 years old, he had died from complications related to his medical conditions. Grace was 15 at the time, and losing her brother had devastated her. She told Marcus that David had been the sweetest, most joyful person she had ever known, despite all the challenges he faced. She had promised herself that if she ever had the opportunity, she would try to help other families avoid the isolation and struggles that her family had experienced. Grace explained that she had been working with families of children with special needs for over 20 years, first as a volunteer and later as a professional aide in schools and community centers. But she had always dreamed of creating a program where families could come together in a comfortable, welcoming environment where their children could just be themselves. When Grace began working for Marcus, she was amazed by his beautiful house and its perfect location. It was accessible for wheelchairs, had plenty of space for activities, and was in a neighborhood where families felt safe. But more than that, Grace said she felt that the house seemed empty and lonely, like it was waiting for something to give it life and purpose. Grace admitted that she had started small, inviting just one family to bring their child for a playdate. But word had spread quickly among parents of children with special needs, and soon she was hosting regular gatherings. She knew she should have asked Marcus's permission, but she was afraid he would say no, and these families desperately needed what she was providing. As Grace told her story, Marcus began to understand the depth of her commitment to this work. She wasn't just providing activities for children. She was honoring the memory of her brother by making sure other families didn't experience the isolation and lack of support that her family had endured. Her work was both a tribute to David and a way of healing from the loss that had shaped her entire adult life. Grace looked at Marcus with tears in her eyes and told him she was prepared to find another job if he wanted her to leave. She said she understood that she had violated his trust by using his house without permission, and she was ready to accept the consequences of her actions. But she also asked him to consider allowing the program to continue, even if she couldn't be the one to run it. Marcus sat quietly for a long moment, processing everything Grace had told him. He thought about his own lonely life in his empty house. He thought about the joy and warmth he had witnessed that afternoon. And he thought about Grace's dedication to helping families who needed support and community. Finally, Marcus looked at Grace and told her that he wanted to hear more about her program. He wanted to understand exactly what resources these families needed and how he might be able to help. Grace looked at him in surprise, as if she couldn't believe he might be willing to support her work rather than punish her for it. Grace stared at Marcus in disbelief, unable to process what she was hearing. She had expected to be fired immediately, possibly even sued for using his property without permission. Instead, Marcus was asking about her program and how he could help. She struggled to find words, her emotions overwhelming her as she realized that her secret work might not only continue but could potentially expand with his support. Marcus could see that Grace was having difficulty responding, so he decided to share something with her that he had never told anyone. He explained that despite all his wealth and success, he felt his life lacked meaning and purpose. He had built an empire, but he had no family to leave it to and no legacy beyond making money. Watching Grace's program that afternoon had shown him something he had been missing, the joy that came from genuinely helping others. Grace slowly began to tell Marcus about the challenges these families faced every day. She explained that many parents of children with special needs felt isolated because their children weren't welcome in typical community programs. Playgrounds were often not accessible. Birthday parties became difficult when other children didn't understand disabilities, and many families stopped socializing altogether because it was easier than dealing with stares and uncomfortable questions. Marcus listened intently as Grace described the practical problems these families encountered. She told him about parents who had to quit their jobs because they couldn't find adequate childcare for children with special needs. She spoke about families who went into debt paying for therapy and equipment that insurance wouldn't cover. She described the emotional toll on parents who watched their children struggle to make friends and be accepted by their communities. Grace also explained how her informal program was helping to address some of these issues. Beyond providing a safe space for children to play and socialize, she was connecting families with resources and support services. She helped parents navigate complex systems to get services for their children. She organized carpools so families could attend medical appointments together. She even helped families apply for grants and assistance programs they didn't know existed. As Grace talked, Marcus began to understand the scope of what she had created. This wasn't just a weekly playgroup. It was a comprehensive support network that was filling crucial gaps in services for families with special needs children. Grace had become an advocate, resource coordinator, and community builder, all while working as his housekeeper and using her own time and money to fund her activities. Marcus asked Grace about the costs involved in running her program. Grace looked embarrassed as she admitted that she had been paying for all the supplies, snacks, and materials herself. She had been spending nearly half of her salary from him on art supplies, adaptive toys, and special foods for children with dietary restrictions. She had also been using her own car to transport families who didn't have reliable transportation. The more Marcus learned about Grace's dedication, the more impressed he became. She was not only donating her time and energy, but was also making significant financial sacrifices to help these families. She was living modestly so that she could afford to provide services that these children desperately needed, but couldn't get anywhere else. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking out at his perfectly manicured gardens. He told Grace that he wanted to propose something that might sound unusual. He said that if she was willing, he would like to make her program official and provide the resources it needed to serve even more families. He offered to convert part of his house into a permanent space for her activities and to cover all the costs associated with running the program. Grace couldn't believe what she was hearing. She asked Marcus if he was serious, and he assured her that he had never been more serious about anything in his life. He explained that he had been looking for a way to use his wealth for something meaningful, and her program was exactly the kind of work he wanted to support. Marcus began outlining his vision for expanding Grace's program. He suggested converting his rarely used dining room and adjacent sunroom into dedicated activity spaces. He proposed installing specialized equipment like ceiling-mounted lifts for children with mobility challenges and creating a sensory room for children with autism or other sensory processing needs. He even suggested building a playground in his backyard that would be fully accessible for children with disabilities. Grace listened in amazement as Marcus described possibilities she had never dared to dream about. He talked about hiring additional staff to help her serve more families and providing transportation services for families who needed assistance getting to the program. He mentioned creating a resource library where families could borrow adaptive equipment and educational materials, but Marcus's most surprising proposal was that he wanted to establish a foundation to support families of children with special needs throughout their community and beyond. He envisioned providing scholarships for therapy services, grants for families to purchase necessary equipment, and funding for other community organizations doing similar work. Grace began to cry again, but this time her tears were from joy and gratitude rather than fear and sadness. She told Marcus that his support would allow her to help so many more families and would give her the resources to create the kind of comprehensive program she had always dreamed of building. She said it would be like having her brother's memory honored in a way that could touch hundreds of lives. Marcus was moved by Grace's emotion and realized that this partnership would be as meaningful for him as it would be for the families they would serve. He had found a way to use his success to create something lasting and important. For the first time in years, he felt excited about the future and proud of what his wealth could accomplish. Grace composed herself and began sharing more specific ideas about how the expanded program could work. She talked about creating support groups for parents, offering educational workshops about disability rights and resources, and establishing partnerships with local schools and medical professionals. She had clearly been thinking about these possibilities for a long time, but had never imagined she would have the resources to make them reality. As the evening progressed, Marcus and Grace continued planning their collaboration. They discussed timelines for renovating the house, procedures for making the program official and legal, and strategies for reaching more families who could benefit from their services. Marcus was impressed by Grace's knowledge and experience, and Grace was amazed by Marcus's enthusiasm and commitment to the project. By the time they finished talking, it was nearly midnight. Grace apologized for keeping Marcus up so late on his first night back from his business trip, but Marcus assured her that this conversation had been the most important and energizing discussion he had had in years. He told her that she had given him something he thought he had lost forever, a sense of purpose and the opportunity to make a real difference in people's lives. The next morning, Marcus woke up with more energy and excitement than he had felt in years. He had barely slept, but his mind was buzzing with ideas for the foundation and programs he and Grace would create together. He found Grace in the kitchen preparing breakfast, and she looked equally energized despite their late night of planning. Over breakfast, they continued discussing their partnership. Marcus pulled out his laptop and began showing Grace examples of other foundations and programs for families with special needs children. He was amazed by how much research Grace had already done on best practices and innovative approaches to serving this population. Her knowledge rivaled that of professional program administrators he had worked with in his business ventures. Grace shared her notebook, which contained detailed observations about each family she had been working with. She had documented their individual needs, goals, and progress in a way that impressed Marcus with its thoroughness and insight. She had also compiled extensive lists of resources, contacts, and potential partnerships that could enhance their future programs. Marcus realized that Grace possessed all the qualities of an excellent nonprofit director. She understood the needs of the families she served. She was skilled at building relationships and partnerships, and she had the organizational abilities necessary to manage complex programs. He proposed that she become the official director of their new foundation, with a salary that reflected the importance and scope of her work. Grace was overwhelmed by Marcus's confidence in her abilities. She had never seen herself as anything more than a volunteer who wanted to help families like her own had been. But Marcus helped her recognize that her years of experience, her natural skills, and her deep commitment to the work made her the perfect person to lead their foundation. They spent the morning calling contractors and architects to begin planning the renovations to Marcus's house. Marcus was determined to move quickly, knowing that the families Grace had been serving shouldn't have to wait long for improved facilities and expanded services. He instructed his contractors to prioritize the project and spare no expense in creating spaces that would be perfect for children with special needs. Grace suggested they visit some existing programs to get ideas for their renovations. Marcus agreed immediately, and they spent the afternoon touring facilities and speaking with other program directors. Marcus was impressed by Grace's thoughtful questions and her ability to envision how different design elements could be adapted for their specific needs. At each facility they visited, Marcus noticed how other staff members responded to Grace. They clearly recognized her as someone who understood the work at a deep level, and they shared information and ideas with her as a professional colleague. Marcus realized that Grace was already well known and respected in the community of people serving families with special needs. During their visits, Marcus learned more about the broader challenges facing families of children with disabilities. He discovered that waiting lists for services were often months or years long, that many families went without needed services because of cost, and that isolation and stress were common problems for parents and siblings of children with special needs. Grace introduced Marcus to several other parents who shared their stories about the difficulties they faced in finding appropriate programs and support for their children. Marcus was struck by their resilience and dedication, but also by their exhaustion and worry about their children's futures. He began to understand why Grace's informal program had become so important to these families. That evening, Marcus called his lawyer to begin the legal process of establishing their foundation. He wanted to ensure that everything was done properly, and that the foundation would be eligible for grants and tax-exempt donations. His lawyer was surprised by Marcus's sudden interest in charitable work, but he was impressed by the thoughtfulness and scope of the plans Marcus described. Grace spent the evening calling the families she had been working with to tell them about the exciting developments. Parents were amazed and thrilled to learn that their informal playgroup was going to become an official program with professional facilities and expanded services. Many offered to volunteer their time and skills to help with the transition and expansion. Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into the project with the same intensity he had always applied to his business ventures. He hired the best architects and contractors, consulted with occupational therapists and special education experts, and researched the latest equipment and technologies that could benefit children with disabilities. Grace worked alongside Marcus, providing input on every decision and helping him understand the practical needs of the families they would serve. She attended meetings with contractors, reviewed architectural plans, and tested equipment to ensure it would work for children with different types of disabilities. The renovation process was extensive. Marcus converted his formal dining room into a large, multi-purpose activity space with specialized flooring that was safe for children who fell frequently. The adjacent sunroom became a quiet sensory space with adjustable lighting, sound-dampening materials, and equipment designed to help children with autism and sensory processing disorders. They installed a wheelchair-accessible bathroom with an adult-sized changing table and specialized equipment. For children who needed assistance with personal care, Marcus's home office was converted into a resource library where families could access information, borrow adaptive equipment, and meet privately with Grace for individual consultations. The backyard transformation was even more impressive. Marcus built a fully accessible playground with ramps, sensory gardens, and equipment that children with various disabilities could use safely. He installed a therapeutic pool with a lift system and hired a physical therapist to provide aquatic therapy sessions for children who could benefit from water-based exercises. During the renovation process, word about the new foundation spread throughout the community. Marcus and Grace began receiving calls from other families, medical professionals, and community organizations who wanted to learn more about their programs. They realized there was a much greater need for their services than they had initially understood. Marcus hired additional staff members, including a social worker, an occupational therapist, and several trained aides who had experience working with children with special needs. Grace interviewed each potential staff member personally, ensuring they shared her philosophy of treating each child and family with dignity, respect, and genuine care. The foundation also attracted attention from local media, and Marcus found himself giving interviews about his transformation from businessman to philanthropist. He always made sure to credit Grace as the inspiration for the foundation and to emphasize that the programs were built around her vision and expertise. One particularly meaningful moment came when Marcus met David's parents, Grace's mother and father, who had driven several hours to see what their daughter was creating. Grace's mother cried as she toured the facilities, telling Marcus that she could see David's spirit in every room and that she knew he would have loved playing in these spaces. Grace's father pulled Marcus aside and thanked him for recognizing his daughter's talents and giving her the resources to honor her brother's memory in such a beautiful way. He told Marcus that Grace had carried the pain of losing David for many years, but had channeled that pain into a determination to help other families avoid the struggles they had experienced. As the official opening day approached, Marcus and Grace worked together to plan a celebration that would introduce the community to their new foundation. They invited local officials, medical professionals, other nonprofit organizations, and of course, all the families Grace had been working with informally. Marcus was nervous about the opening event, worried that he might not know how to interact appropriately with the children and families who would be attending. But Grace assured him that his genuine desire to help would be evident to everyone, and that the families would appreciate his support regardless of whether he had experience with disability-related issues. The night before the opening, Marcus and Grace walked through the completed facilities together. Marcus marveled at how his cold, formal house had been transformed into a warm, welcoming space that radiated hope and possibility. Grace pointed out details that showed how thoughtfully everything had been designed. The way natural light filled each room, the careful placement of equipment to maximize independence, and the artistic touches that made the space beautiful as well as functional. Standing in the main activity room, surrounded by the results of their collaboration, Marcus realized that his life had been completely transformed. He had found a purpose that went beyond making money, a partnership with someone who shared his values, and a way to create a lasting legacy that would touch countless lives. Grace had given him something more valuable than any business deal he had ever closed. She had given him the opportunity to make a real difference in the world. The opening day of the David Johnson Foundation for Families arrived with perfect weather and an atmosphere of celebration and hope. Marcus had insisted on naming the foundation after Grace's brother, recognizing that David's memory was the driving force behind everything they had created together. Families began arriving early in the morning, many of whom had been part of Grace's informal program, while others were experiencing the foundation for the first time. Marcus stood at the entrance greeting everyone personally, and he was moved by the excitement and gratitude he saw in parents' faces as they realized what had been created for their children. The children immediately began exploring their new spaces with wonder and delight. Marcus watched as a little girl in a wheelchair independently accessed the art station, using the specially designed adjustable table. A boy with autism discovered the sensory room and spent several minutes exploring the different textures and lighting options, his face showing the calm focus that Grace had explained these environments could provide. During the formal dedication ceremony, Marcus gave a speech that surprised everyone, including himself with its emotion and authenticity. He spoke about how Grace had taught him that true wealth came not from accumulating money, but from using resources to create opportunities for others. He talked about David, whom he had never met but whose spirit had inspired this entire project. Grace was invited to speak next, and her words moved everyone present. She talked about her brother's joy and determination despite the challenges he faced, and how his memory had motivated her to ensure that other families would have the support and community her family had wished for. She thanked Marcus not just for his financial support, but for his willingness to open his heart and his home to create something meaningful. The most powerful moment of the ceremony came when Emma, the little girl who had sung at one of Grace's first gatherings, performed a song she had written especially for the opening day. Her lyrics talked about friendship, acceptance, and having a place where everyone belonged. As she sang, Marcus noticed that there wasn't a dry eye in the audience, including his own. After the ceremony, families explored all the facilities and participated in various activities. Marcus found himself naturally interacting with the children, no longer nervous about saying or doing the wrong thing. Grace had been right. His genuine desire to help was evident, and the children responded to his kindness without any concern about his wealth or status. A teenage boy with cerebral palsy showed Marcus how the new computer station allowed him to create digital art more easily than ever before. The boy's pride in his work and excitement about the possibilities was infectious, and Marcus found himself making plans to upgrade the technology even further based on the young man's suggestions. Parents approached Marcus throughout the day to share their gratitude and their stories. A mother told him that her daughter with Down syndrome had gained confidence and social skills through Grace's program that she never could have developed elsewhere. A father explained that the foundation had connected his family with resources that had transformed their son's educational experience. Marcus was particularly moved by a conversation with a grandmother who was raising her grandson with autism. She told him that Grace's program had been the first place she had found where other people understood the challenges and joys of caring for a child with special needs. She said the foundation had given her hope for her grandson's future and had reminded her that she wasn't alone in her journey. As the day progressed, Marcus realized that the foundation was already exceeding his expectations. He watched Grace moving through the spaces she had helped design, working with children and families with the skill and dedication that had first amazed him. But now she had the resources and support to serve many more families and to provide services that went far beyond what she had been able to offer in his living room. Local officials and community leaders who attended the opening expressed their support for the foundation and their interest in collaborating on future projects. Marcus learned about other gaps in services that the foundation might be able to address, and he began envisioning expansions that could serve families throughout the region. Near the end of the day, Marcus and Grace found a quiet moment together in the resource library. Grace thanked him again for everything he had made possible, but Marcus stopped her and explained that she was the one who deserved thanks. He told her that she had given him a purpose and meaning that all his business success had never provided. Marcus shared that he had decided to step back from most of his business activities to focus on the foundation and other philanthropic work. He said that working with Grace had shown him what he really wanted to do with his life and his resources. He wanted to create more programs like this one, to support other people doing similar work, and to use his wealth in ways that would create lasting positive change. Grace looked around the library, filled with resources for families and information about services and opportunities for children with special needs. She thought about David and how proud he would have been to see what had grown from her desire to honor his memory. She thought about all the families who would be helped by this foundation and the many more who might benefit from similar programs in the future. The foundation's opening day ended with a community dinner where families shared their hopes and dreams for their children. Marcus listened to parents talk about their aspirations for their children's education, independence, and happiness. He realized that these families weren't just hoping for basic services. They were dreaming of full, rich lives for their children, and they now had a place that supported those dreams. As the last families departed that evening, Marcus and Grace walked through the quiet spaces that had been filled with laughter and joy all day. Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From a successful but lonely businessman to a partner in creating something that truly mattered. Grace looked at a photo on the wall showing David as a young boy, smiling despite the medical equipment around him. She whispered a promise to her brother that this foundation would continue to grow and serve families for many years to come, ensuring that his memory would live on through every child who found acceptance, support, and joy in these spaces. Marcus realized that coming home early from his business trip and discovering Grace's secret had been the most fortunate accident of his life. He had found not just a purpose for his wealth, but a way to create a legacy that would outlast any business empire. Together, he and Grace had transformed his empty house into a place filled with hope, love, and endless possibilities for the future.